Welcome everyone to our next installation of our coffee break webinar series, Mastering Grant Implementation, the Art and Science of Project Resilience and Success. Hopefully you have a nice hot cup of coffee with you or a nice hot cup of tea as well and ready to learn some hopefully really great information. To create context for our conversation today, let's start by considering this piece of art, which is probably one of the most well-known pieces of art in Western culture, which is known as Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. And while you may not know this piece of work by name, you definitely know it by sight. And as a little interesting factoid, this piece of work is based on strict mathematical formulations by an 80 BC architect, Vitruvius. And he outlined with mathematical exactitude how to place a man in a circle and in a square. Over time, there have been many attempts to try to create this, to try to create an actual drawing of what Vitruvius had outlined. But there was no better interpretation than Leonardo's interpretation in terms of just the beauty that was created, in large part because of his devotion and passion to art and science. And indeed, Walter Isaacson, who is the biographer of, one of many biographers of Da Vinci, said, Da Vinci became the archetype of the Renaissance man, an inspiration to all who believe that the infinite works of nature, as he put it, are woven together in a unity filled with marvelous patterns. Walterson went on to say, his ability to combine art and science made iconic by his drawing of a perfectly proportioned man, spread eagle inside a circle and square known as Vitruvian Man, made him history's most creative genius. And so we're taking a lesson from this creative genius to provide insights into creating project resilience and project success by looking at implementation through the lens of science and art. And to be clear, what we mean by art and science is in art, we're talking about managing the human equation of the grant implementation, such as the cognitions and emotions at the individual and project level. And then the science of those pieces in terms of, science of implementation through the strategies, approaches, and techniques that the individual and project teams can use for grant implementation. So today, what we want to do are really twofold. First, talk about the art, talk about how to address the cognitive and emotional response to a project, but then also talk about the science to provide strategies, methods, and tools that can be implemented. And of course, as always, we are here to answer your questions. So before we go too much further into our conversation, let me introduce ourselves. I'm Lana Rucks, and we are with the Rucks Group. And the Rucks Group is a research and program evaluation firm. And since 2008, we have worked with a variety of entities in higher ed and workforce development, and we really work to transform data into insight, empowering decision makers to be able to tackle the world's most wicked challenges. I am president and CEO of the Rucks Group, but I also have here Elise Hopes. So I'm going to turn things over to Elise to allow her to introduce herself and share more about her role on the webinar today. So Elise.
Thanks, Lana. It's great to have you all here this afternoon. Again, my name is Elise Hopes, and I'm the Business Development Manager with the Rucks Group. But for today's webinar, I will be helping to moderate the Q&A portion of the webinar that we have sprinkled throughout the session that we have today. So you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is an icon with two little chat bubbles and Q&A. You can use that to send in any questions that may emerge for you as we're going through the webinar. And we also have the chat available if you want to share out additional thoughts to the other members who are joining the webinar today. I should note too that sometimes it can take a little bit of a moment from the time that you send in your question to when we receive it on our end. So if we're not able to answer or address your question at that particular Q&A segment, then we'll be sure to follow up via email, as well as any other unaddressed questions that we're unable to get through in today's 30 minutes. So please do, we encourage you to share all of your questions and thoughts that you have. And I think with that, Lana, I can turn things back over to you.
Excellent. Well, we have a lot of great information to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. And let's first talk about the art of grant implementation. So one of the things I like to think about, and I had a former colleague who really used to sensitize me to this, is that when we talk about a grant, we're really talking about two grants. Talking about the grant that existed when we planned it and the grant that exists in reality. When we plan a grant, everything is very clearly laid out. Everything is very outlined, and we really aren't kind of anticipating some of the challenges that may happen. Whereas in reality, there's a lot of twists and turns, a lot of whirlwind of improvisation. And if you think about that planned grant, that emerges when all that excitement that you experience when you hear about the solicitation, or the excitement that you first feel when you've learned that you've received a grant, sometimes gives way to the realities that after a while you have a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety with that grant. So let's talk for a moment about what some of the occurrences or what can happen that will cause this transition between planning and that emotional response that's occurring at planning stage and then what's happening in reality. So one common challenge that happens is that in planning time, in that planning period, you kind of assume that you're going to be able to find time to be able to work on project tasks. You have outlined a certain amount of time, and when you outline it, you think that it's either sufficient or you're going to figure out a way to be able to make it sufficient. And in reality, key individuals just become really busy. Life starts happening, job demands start to shift, and it makes it very difficult to spend the time that you need to be able to spend on the project. Another challenge could be that team members just that what you think about from a planning standpoint is that team members are going to stay for the duration of that grant. However you think about the duration of the grant. Sometimes team members are expected to stay for just a year or 6 months, that they're going to come in the third year, the fourth year, or however that is actually outlined. But in reality, whatever you have outlined, that doesn't happen. That if they're supposed to come in the second year, they're not able to. And that really leaves a lot of gaps. It could leave knowledge gaps or just overall just resource gaps. From the plan standpoint, you expect the intervention to work, and that you expect it to produce certain outcomes. And that can be true because you already piloted, or you have outlined how you're going to pilot and how you're going to test the intervention. But no matter how you think about the intervention, sometimes that intervention just doesn't work out the way that you expect it to. And then another piece could really be just the landscape in which you're operating in shifts. You weren't expecting it. You expected it to be a certain type of landscape. And in the reality, things are shifting. It could be shifting just because institution has changed in terms of its supportive grants, or just overall, just the overall grant landscape is really shifting as well. So all of those things combined can really create a visceral emotional response to the grant. And I want us to really be kind of real about that experience. You know, a lot of us, if we're working in the grant space, can be very kind of cognitive oriented and may minimize our emotional responses to this. But I want you to be really real about what that experience is, because if we accept what our experiences are, then we can start kind of tracking out a pathway to change what that emotional response is. So if you want, you can go ahead and put in the chat what some of those emotional responses have been, but let's figure out how we can start creating a pathway towards a different emotional response. To do that, let's just, from a very simplified standpoint, unpack what creates our emotional responses. So what happens is that there's some type of activating event we have some sort of physiological response to that event. And then we have thoughts that are associated with that. Those two begin to feed off of each other, and that creates an emotion. And eventually, that emotion is going to lead to an action. And that process, that emotional process of having a physiological response and cognition, really happens very quickly. And if this happens in the way that that emotional response, or excuse me, the cognitions are positive, then we will very likely have some type of positive emotion. It could be excitement or enthusiasm. Or if that emotional response is more negative, excuse me, the cognitions are more negative, we would have a more negative response, such as anxiety or angst. So what's really driving some of that, those labels? And one piece that research is showing us is that our mindsets, our kind of quote unquote mindset, start to create an almost automatic response to how we begin to label our physiological response. And they create a lens in which we begin to see the world. So very common, you've heard about in the literature within a number of domains within society is the growth fixed mindset, which is that personal attributes are changeable, and that would make it growth oriented, or if they're not, it's fixed oriented. But you can also have a mindset of open and closed. Open is that you're more invested in the truth, or closed where you're more welded to being right. Promotion, where you're really seeking out gains. What can I get? Versus prevention, where you're trying to avoid losses. Or it can be outward and inward focus, in which you're more focused on others rather than being focused on yourself. And what we know, again, from the literature is that the more growth, open, promotion, or outward focused we are, the more that the labels that we attribute to our physiological response are productive, allowing us to have a much more productive response. So then the question has to be, well then, okay, Lana, you just said all of this happens automatically, but you're supposed to have this growth, open, promotion, outward mindset. What am I supposed to do about that? Well, while that emotional response happens very rapidly, almost automatically, or I should say it does happen automatically, the other piece that's also emerging as well is that we have a deliberate system too. And our deliberate system allows us to actually retrain our automatic system. So let me give like a really short example of how this works. So on the next page, I'm going to show you a picture. And on this picture, I want you to count how many red pieces of candy that exist. All right. So you're going to get 10 seconds. So if you're ready, let me show you the picture. Okay, now that you're done and you've counted how many pieces of red candy, I want you to tell me how many pieces of white candy there are. And if you're like most people, it would probably be pretty hard for you to be able to count how many white pieces of candy there are. And this really, in short, kind of demonstrates that our deliberate system, what we focus on, starts really becoming our lens. So this is something that we can change. And for those who were counting the red pieces of candy, there are actually 23 red pieces of candy. So to kind of summarize our art piece, here are some takeaways. One, in order to build project resilience, one piece is really trying to help deliberately reframe challenges. Our emotional responses are a result of how we are labeling our physiological challenges that we're experiencing. And it's important to kind of keep in mind, we don't see things as they are, we see things more as we are. And then also just to make sure to keep working on your natural reactions to ultimately change your actions. So let me pause there and turn things over to Elise to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we do actually have a question. It's a two-parter. So the first part to the question is, how can I tell if my team has a fixed or growth mindset? And then the second part to that is, do you have any tips for helping a team to develop a growth mindset?
Hmm. Um, those are really good questions. And I'm actually going to go to the second question first. I think some of the tips in terms of being able to cultivate a growth mindset is to really cultivate a sense of curiosity among the team, create a culture of curiosity, and also a sense of playfulness, and to also really, if depending on how people talk about things, really reframing that. And there could be, to a certain extent, a lot of really consciousness in terms of how you approach that, um, and how you're approaching um, uh, creating that playfulness, creating that curiosity. You may have to put it on your meeting notes, but that could be one way to help pull people away from the growth mindset. And then I guess another to help answer that second part is this first part is in regards to how do you know if people have a fixed mindset? There's a couple of things that we sometimes will see. Sometimes we'll see, really pulling away of project team members from their tasks. So if someone's supposed to do something, you no longer hear from that person anymore. If they're not coming to meetings because they're pulling away, and then sometimes also just in the way that they're talking about the work, and that they're having challenges, or the fact that they're never having any challenges can also kind of start to point to this kind of fixed mindset. And if you start seeing people exhibiting those behaviors, especially the ghosting piece where people are really pulling away from the work, you probably really try to reach out to them, see if you can get a hold of them and just have a conversation about what's going on, what's occurring, and really trying to create a supportive environment, which is, again, um, a lot of people have limited time, limited resources. And so if they do come to a meeting or encourage them to come to a meeting, that's something you can do within that time frame. So hopefully some of those that perspective will help in terms of thinking about how to identify as well as how to address that fixed mindset and creating growth mindset. In the interest of time, you said there was that one question. So okay, I will go ahead and go on to the next component. And if you do have additional questions, make sure to provide those as well. So let's switch to the science of brand implementation for a moment here. So let me bring back up some of the challenges that we talked about at that opening. The challenges around finding time, um, the fact that people are leaving, the intervention doesn't work, and shifts in the environment. And I'm going to try to walk through here some tools or some strategies that may help in terms of addressing each parts of those different common challenges. So the first challenge in terms of not finding enough time. Well, one piece that we have seen that has worked very well in terms of trying to address what I call these competing priorities is if project teams have a standard meeting time and they honor that meeting time. So there's this time that project team is meeting. I think that's pretty common. But where we see that this works very well is they honor that time. They're coming to that meeting, they're not scheduling on top of that meeting time. And if they don't have any particular topics that they need to be able to go over, then they're working individually on other grant related tasks. So someone doesn't not go because they haven't finished a particular assigned task. They're going to the meeting, or minimally they're using that time to be able to actually work on what they started and maybe being able to problem solve together. Another piece that can have a number of different benefits, and that the use of AI tools really vary by institutions and what the policies. So, but leveraging AI tools can also be helpful in terms of reducing loads, can help in terms of scheduling, can also be really helpful in terms of taking project team meeting notes. So those can be a couple of solutions in terms of being able to really address those competing priority challenges. The other challenge is in regards to how do you address the fact that people leave and that's really leaving gaps within teams. One piece, and this is really borrowing from team science, is really developing a contingency plan around conducting an assessment of knowledge and skills needed to successfully execute the project. And we've actually developed a project team assessment tool that's available that we can send out later to you that you can have access to. And this type of assessment tool is really to serve as a discussion prompt about what types of skills do you need, when do you need those skills, who do you talk to within your organization, do you know what is needed to be able to perform a particular task. So it's really not necessarily intended to be completely exhaustive per se. It's really intended to start having that conversation around what skills you need, and then to be able to have some contingency plans around that. And I would actually tie that back to the previous solution too, of having out planned meeting times for your project team. And if you don't have agenda item, that's where you can start thinking about contingency plans. What happens if this person leaves? What happens if that person leaves? Is there someone else that we can kind of start creating a bench around to be able to fill in those gaps in a much more rapid way? Really keeping in mind that, grants are 3 years to 5 years in time. And so you really have a limited amount of time to make these adjustments. So the more that you're having these conversations to proactively think about how to address if something goes sideways in terms of project team members, will really help you to conserve time. Another element too that we see often is that an intervention just may not necessarily produce the expected outcome. And that you're not seeing the outcomes that you really want or thought that were going to occur. So some other strategies too around this is that you want to make sure that you're implementing quickly, learning quickly, and re-strategizing quickly. Again, as I was noting before, that you have a relatively short period of time to be able to implement the grant. And the longer that you're taking in regards to learning if something is working or not working, the longer it's going to take you to really be able to see to be able to fix things and to see how things are actually working. So you want to move things quickly. And again, being able to move things quickly is really going to be in part related to addressing the art, addressing the emotions. And I think that's related too to the other piece is just sitting with challenges, even if solutions the solutions aren't clear, if the solutions are unclear. Not pulling away from what those challenges are, but really moving into what that problem space and exploring and trying something and moving forward. What we've seen very often is that the ideas and the solutions are so iterative that you try something, then you try something else. And so moving into the problem space will really help in terms of trying to address how to remedy an intervention that's not working. But this quotation that I found from Ryan Hawk from The Pursuit of Excellence, I really just love because I think that this helps in terms of thinking about interventions that aren't working, is that experience is not the best teacher, but evaluated learning from experience is the best teacher. So really thinking about and evaluating what's working, what's not working, because sometimes there's some element within the intervention or in the approach that is working. And so if you understand that piece, that could be replicated. But there's multiple layers to interventions. And so sitting in those problem spaces, learning quickly will really be helpful. Then another piece is that the landscape just is shifting. And I think for those of us who are in the grant space, we can understand and appreciate how things can really shift real quickly. So what are some of the things that you can do? Well, one, I think it's really helpful to do an audience analysis tool. And the audience analysis tool is just really understanding who are all the different entities that have a stake in your work. And thinking about that in terms of how you position, how you think about, how you talk about your initiative. I think this type of audience analysis, while it's not going to necessarily allow you to foresee all the ways in which the landscape may shift, it may help in terms of creating some consciousness. Well, you know what, in this, you know, these are individuals or these are entities that have a stake. What are they interested in? And could this have an impact on what we're doing? And again, these are things that you can talk about when you're having those standardized meetings. Again, if you don't have something else pressing in your meetings, then you can talk about this audience analysis, understanding who has a stake in your work. So let me kind of summarize this real quickly and then take a Q&A break. So the key to building project resilience for success is implementing the right strategies, methods, and tools. But to be able to do that, you want to make sure that you're also addressing the art. Until you can reframe items and to reduce that kind of negative emotional response, it's really hard to implement the science piece towards project resilience. To do that, making sure you're providing the space and structure to be able to implement the science. And then just remember too, that all of this is not linear, but exponential. And that's another reason why you want to move real quickly with addressing challenges. So let me pause there to see if there are any additional questions.
Yes, we do have one. It's when is the right time to complete an audience analysis and who should be involved in that process?
Okay, so there's the ideal time, and then there's probably where it may realistically occur. Ideally, I would say if you could start in the proposal phase. I think that one of the, you know, with the audience analysis as well as with a team member assessment, I think it's really helpful to understand or just get your perspective on the fact of who has a stake in what you're doing. So I think proposal for both of those tools will really be helpful to really think about the entire landscape. I think that's just really helpful. And depending on the size of your grant, I think it's more useful or not, or that it's going to have more entities, a larger audience, I guess is a better way of saying that. So I think proposal. I think the other phase, definitely sometime at the beginning or at any point you start to realize that it's something that you should do. So there's not a bad time for it. And it just, again, starts to create consciousness of the fact that a grant has a lot of people who have a stake in that, and you can fold that knowledge within that project. So I'm going to go on because we have 2 minutes left. So I just have a couple. I think we'll have time for one more question, but I do want to go through a couple of other items. I did just want to highlight, again, we are an evaluation firm. We provide a variety of services to our clients. If any of these areas are something that you may need assistance with, or if you would just like to chat about some of the things that we've covered today to learn more, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I would also say that we have some additional resources. If you go to our website, some webinars that we think that would be of really great use to help thinking about the art and science of project implementation. And then finally, make plans to join us on May 22nd, where we're going to be talking about annual reporting. So with that, I think maybe we have 30 seconds. Is there a question that I can answer? I'll try to give a short answer. and multi-layered
Yes.
answers.
So the question is, how do you get your project PI on board with thinking about the art as well as the science?
I think that's really a good question. I think one is in regard, it depends on what your relationship is with that individual. I think one, if they are depending on understand what's in it for them, understand where their motivations are, understand what their vision is, and link all of that to this component. So even in talking about the emotions piece of it, which we're framing as the art, but there's the science to that as well. So if this is an individual who doesn't really recognize, the science, the emotional piece of the grant process, then link it to the science component. And there is that actual science piece of it. There's a literature, is quoting Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, a lot of information within there to be able to frame that as a persuasive message, but really understanding that person, doing an audience analysis of the PI, what's their stake, and linking this information to that. I said I was going to get a quick response that was multi-layered, but that was a really great question. Again, if there are other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I'll just remind you, it's the science and the art together that's going to lead to project success and resilience. It's been so much fun to be with you, to work with you today and share with you this information. And I hope to hear from you all soon. If not, I'll see you in May. Thanks. Bye.